The 2024 legislative session just wrapped up on Friday. And what was in it for Jacksonville? To answer that question, we're joined by Florida Politics Capitol reporter and Jacksonville Today columnist AG Gancarski. Hey, AG.
Hey, good morning, Ian. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. And to our listeners, if you have questions about what did and didn't happen in Tallahassee this session, you can reach out at 904-549-2937 or email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also reach out via social media. So, AG, let's start with the bacon. How did we fare in terms of appropriations?
Well, you could look at it two different ways. In terms of what the city actually got, not much. Got like $3 million for a few road projects. But when you look at stakeholders in the area, like the sort of organizations and such, they did a little better. The UF Health campus in downtown got $75 million, another $75 million, so that's good. JTA got some resources. And basically things like that. UF Health got $10 million. So you've got stakeholders that actually did okay in this budget. Sheriff Waters, I think, got about $600,000 for a car.
And Jacksport was, I think, one that you had noted too.
Right, the cranes. They got $26 million this year, got $30 million the year before. John Rood, local donor, he was a big winner. The Jacksonville Classical Academy got $6 million in the budget, $5 million for a gym. So, some people did well, but the city itself kind of struck out.
Yeah, $3 million seems really paltry when you're talking about all those other numbers. I've seen an analysis that said of the $70 million that the city sought for 7 projects, it ended up getting $3 million, as you said, for just 3 of those projects. What went so wrong for the city of Jacksonville in terms of getting those dollars?
Well, I think it's just the party divide, really. I think it's something where you had a Republican mayor for 8 years. He would be able to get what he wanted out of Tallahassee pretty much. Lenny Curry got his pension deal, got the Hart Bridge, got the first round of money for UF Health. Those were all good things, but it was a little bit harder, or for the UF campus downtown. I keep saying that wrong. But it's a little hard for Donna Deegan, being a Democrat and having to, reflect Democratic priorities of the people who elected her in the city. She's having to speak out against Governor DeSantis, speak out against the legislature and various things. So she spent a lot of the session on her back foot, basically. We talked about this a little already, but the Confederate Monument Bill that took a lot of months in the first part of the session.
Remind us what that would have done.
Yeah, the Confederate Monument Bill basically is a protection bill. It would have made cities keep up Confederate monuments, and it actually had a retroactive component in it where it would have forced Jacksonville to either put up old monuments. It could have led for punishment for local officials, things like that. The House and the Senate bills never fully reconciled, but the fact is there was punishment for localities like Jacksonville that took down monuments. It could have been monetary punishment, could have been removal from office or suspension, but these are the things that Democratic mayors have to worry about in Ron DeSantis' Florida.
In terms of challenges that Deegan faced, or perhaps just distractions, there was this whole issue of whether language in a tax package was going to basically force a revised, citywide approval of a tax that Lenny Curry sold to taxpayers, a decade ago, but might have needed reauthorization. Tell us about what that was and why that was so important for the Deegan administration to defeat.
Sure. Because basically the language that was in the House bill, it wasn't in the Senate bill, and it basically got stripped out by the end. But it would have required another referendum on the discretionary sales tax in 2026, which would have been the third year of Deegan's term. It would have been a very difficult thing to push, especially with the re-election campaign. It was a poison pill. It would have hurt the city's budget and so on. Wyman Duggan was actually instrumental in getting out of the budget, or getting out of the tax
Jacksonville
bill.
representative.
Right. He's done some lobbying also. And, Wyman Duggan's pretty close to leadership, so he was helpful with that. The Fiorentino group basically tried to save it, and they got it done. They're city lobbyists. They worked to get the language out. But, there was a period when that language was in the House bill, and it seemed like it could have been a live proposition, where you had former Mayor Lenny Curry saying, "I'm going to fix this," and so on. Basically like jumping into the process. And he got some heat for that from some people. I heard about that for a couple of weeks.
He said he was going to fix it for the city?
Yeah.
as a lobbyist.
Yeah, which, the irony of that obviously is that Ballard Partners, the firm he works for, they got fired by the city this summer. So, it'd be sort of like freelance vigilante lobbying. He's lobbying for some other people in the city, but yeah, it was an interesting scenario.
Where did that language come from in the first place?
That is a $64,000 question. We don't know where it came from. Nobody wants to own up to it. I'd love to know. If you're listening and you have insight, please call in. You can solve the mystery. But even the people who are really plugged into the process, they won't hazard a guess as to how that language got in. And that's kind of the frustrating thing about this, because it was deliberate. It came from somewhere. It obviously was intended to serve a purpose. I mean, House Speaker Paul Renner said that it never was intended to apply to Jacksonville. But if you read the language closely, there was no Jacksonville carve out in the language as it was in the House bill. But eventually they got the whole condition out in the Senate. Blaise Ngolia carried that amendment from Spring Hill.
Maybe somebody can check the metadata of the draft legislation and see where it originated.
Yeah, maybe somebody can. So any cyber sleuths out there, you want to do some work this morning, hit me up. I'll pay you my contractor fee.
Well, we're talking about the legislative session that just wrapped up Friday. We're here with AG Gancarski, political reporter and columnist for Jacksonville Today. And if you have questions about the legislative session, or if you have a comment, you can give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org and reach out on social media. Let's talk a little bit about individual lawmakers here. Who were the ones that had, good sessions and not so good sessions from the First Coast?
Well, I mean, it depends on how you want to look at it. I mean, it felt like there were a lot more misses than hits. I mean, I think of Dean Blacken's Confederate Monument Bill is a good example. A lot of wheels spun for nothing there, except for some news cycles and publicity. I think somebody like Angie Nixon on the Democratic side, she did not have a strong session. She hasn't gotten any legislation through, really, any appropriations through. And she spent a lot of this session arguing with Republicans who, to be honest, just completely would bait her on things. People like Alex Andrade and Randy Fine. And she spent a lot of time arguing with them, filing amendments to bills that didn't go anywhere. So in terms of messaging, she was on point. But in terms of things actually bringing home to the district, I'd say she was disappointing. She's got a primary coming up against Brenda Priestley Jackson, and I'm not sure how closely Brenda Priestley Jackson was paying attention to the session, but her case all along has been, this legislator isn't particularly effective.
I want to ask about the messaging and how important that is for somebody like Angie Nixon, because, I mean, as you say, a Democratic mayor even had very little luck getting what she wanted from this legislature. Jacksonville hasn't always had a strong, advocate willing to take on, the power structure in Tallahassee, or the Republicans quite so vigorously as Nixon. So is it possible that her constituency got what it wanted, regardless of the fact that maybe her bills didn't make it through?
I think it was kind of like a sugar high, because, she'd have these moments where she would say exactly what you'd want to hear her say on one issue or another, talking about issues like institutional racism and, microaggressions, things like that, the sort of things that do happen in Tallahassee. But, there is something to be said for bringing home the bacon. I mean, she represents, North Side, Northwest Jacksonville, Riverside, Avondale, places that have like massive flooding issues and things like that. But, the state's not helping. And, in the Riverside, Avondale area specifically, there hasn't been a lot of help because, Wyman Duggan didn't bring home a lot of appropriations. Before that, Jay Fant didn't bring home appropriations. So you go back years and years, and there hasn't been a lot of resources that came back. So, I think that, in a D+30 district, there's a sort of ego boost in hearing somebody say what you're thinking. But at the same time, it is about results. And, when you're looking at results, they weren't really there. Compared to somebody like, say, Senator Tracy Davis. Senator Davis, she doesn't do a lot of bomb throwing. She definitely says what she has to say, but she's not filing amendments willy-nilly to just take up 5 minutes of time at the end of session.
Also a black lawmaker in Jacksonville.
Right.
Yeah.
And, Tracy Davis is going to lead the Senate caucus in 2026. So,
I'm wondering about how the power might shift a little bit to Northeast Florida's favor, not just Davis, serving as the minority leader in that body, but also Sam Garrison, who is set to be Speaker of the House in 2026.
correct. And, that could be helpful.
He's from Clay County. We should
Right.
say, yeah.
Yeah. He claims Jacksonville is his hometown in speeches. I don't know why he doesn't just say Fleming Island or Orange Park or wherever it is. But, it theoretically could be helpful. But this is something, again, where the Deegan administration is going to have to cross party lines, get people who don't align with him, who might have backed Daniel Davis for mayor or Leanna Cumber or whomever, to back their priorities and basically a shared political destiny. That's hard to do in this partisan environment. Garrison's big bill this session was actually about homeless camps.
We actually have a question. We got an email from Susan on Twitter. She says, will Governor DeSantis alter the budget to fund free camping? To be clear, this is Sam Garrison's bill that basically makes it illegal to sleep or camp in public and requires the municipality where those people live to set up a camping zone, essentially, that would have water and facilities and be inspected regularly by DCF, but there's no funding for it.
Right. The governor cannot add money to the budget like that. He does have some mechanisms such as the Job Growth Grant Fund and things like that he uses for sort of corporate welfare projects. That got $75 million this year, but that's not going to be applicable to this program. I mean, DeSantis said he wanted resources in these camps. The Department of Children and Families are going to be there, things like that, once these camps get set up. But, for Jacksonville and for big cities, this is going to be a headache. I know somebody with Sulzbacher who told me just this weekend that they've got a lot of headaches over, what happens to their resources now that there's another state-mandated mouth to feed. It's not like there's going to be more resources for this. And with the state passing an unfunded mandate that's going to basically be, over the state-wide, $500 million a year, it's really challenging for locals, especially because, the kind of financial support they had during COVID from Washington isn't there anymore. We're seeing kind of a cooling in the economy, things like that. The housing market slowed down. So, it's a little more challenging than it used to be. And now cities are going to have to make tough decisions that aren't helped by the state because the state's going to require them to do something they haven't done before. So if you've got like Jacksonville, you've got like some shelters, you've got like, support programs that actually work. You've got an unproven model that's basically going to take resources from those based on spec. And, I don't want to talk about this homeless bill too much, but the Senate sponsor, Jonathan Martin, who carried a lot of, bad bills this year, this being one of them, was asked, why didn't you just do this in Lee County, where you're from, as a pilot? This is a question he got in the Senate committee. And Martin's like, well, this is such a good idea, I want to do it statewide. And I'm like, it's an unproven idea. So, whether it's a good idea, a bad idea or not, it's something that probably should have been piloted out. They didn't do it that way, so now localities are going to reap the harvest.
I want to talk just briefly about a piece of legislation that was brought up by Democratic, sometimes in name only, Representative Kim Daniels. Tell us about this volunteer chaplain bill that she managed to get through.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that she had a lot of Republican help on this, obviously, and she crosses party lines. Once a session on some social conservative bill. This is the one this year. And basically would put kind of youth pastor types in schools. They'd have to basically do a level 2 background check. They would have to, put their name up publicly, and there has to be parental consent for these things. But it's not a formal chaplaincy program like you would see, in a hospital or something like that. These are volunteers. These basically are people coming into schools and, talking to students, offering spiritual counsel or what have you.
And possibly opening the door, as some have noted in their reporting, to Satanists coming into school. Explain how that might work.
Yeah, the Satanic Temple wants a piece of the action, apparently. We'll see if they can pass a level 2 background check. But that basically is what gets opened up in this state specifically when you bring in religion. I mean, there was satanic temple displays at the Capitol in recent years over the holidays. So, these things do happen, and it'll be interesting to see how localities handle this and how they handle giving equal time to all religions without privileging one, because you can assume that what they were expecting was people who subscribe to the religions they subscribe to, not to an actual religious diversity that includes like kind of stunt religions like the Satanic Temple.
Let's talk about Senator Clay Yarborough because he had a somewhat more successful legislative session than some of his colleagues.
Yeah, I mean, I think Clay Yarborough he did some useful things. The one thing that jumps out at me that he did, well, two actually. One was he had this language in a bill that would have like eased up the Chinese land acquisition ban in the state. Governor DeSantis said that he didn't like that during a press conference, and that language disappeared. But the other thing that Clay Yarborough did that was interesting was he had a bill to raise the age for adult entertainment performers from 18 to 21. That bill wasn't going anywhere, so it got attached as language to another bill, which got through on human trafficking. So I mean, that was kind of a veteran maneuver. It was a savvy play. It was one of the savviest plays that I saw out of anybody from this area of the session, out of any legislator, to be sure. I think the only equivalent was, what the credit unions did to actually, get banking access from the state, sort of at the last minute. That was something that was kind of carried by a lot of local lobbyists, Jordan Ellsbury, Jenny Busby, Matt Brockelman. So that was kind of a win for ViStar and other credit unions.
But this was sort of a procedural victory for Clay because he was able to get the age for stripping, essentially, in the state raised to 21 by tacking it into this trafficking bill.
Right. That was exactly it. And, that was modeled after Jacksonville's, sort of permit legislation for adult entertainment performers, strip club performers, and what have you. So, that was a local precedent for that. But yeah, I mean, that was a victory for Clay Yarborough and his priorities.
We've got a question that I think you can answer. Javon emailed, did the bill to prevent utility revenues from going to cities like JEA does with Jacksonville pass?
One more year, we're safe from that. But, there's pressure in Tallahassee against local utilities. There's pressure for FPL, frankly. And I think the move is going to be if they can kick the tires on local utilities and find a way to undermine like these arrangements like Jacksonville has with JEA, they're going to do it over time.
Because we should say, JEA gives a big chunk of money to the city each year. It forms a huge part of their general fund budget. And this bill would have limited basically how much money a city-owned municipally owned utility can give to a city.
Correct. That's the contribution. That's negotiated between JEA and the city council. And that's been upwards of $100 million for some years now, which, basically comes out to less than 10% of the general fund budget, but, significant money, especially, as we move toward a period where capital improvement budgets are going to be tighter, where there's going to be more demands on the city, such as the stadium, such as the need for a new jail, and so on. So, yeah, this contribution is crucial.
We got a question from Julie on X. She says, how much did President Kathleen Passidomo change the tone of this year's session? And she's worth talking about because she did limit some bills coming into the chamber. She's the Senate president. Obviously, she rejected a bill that would have made it easier for teenagers to buy guns, long guns. And she refused to bring a monument bill to the floor. That was after it was openly backed by white supremacists. And she took a very hard stand at the early part of the session saying, we're not going to expand Medicaid. We're going to do this other route. We're not going to be talking about taking those federal dollars. We're going to do it our own way. And so she did, as one would do as the president of the Senate, set an important tone.
Yeah, and the Senate is usually seen as kind of the brakes for the House. I mean, if you just had the House, you would have much more destructive legislation, I think, get through. So the Senate's kind of like the super ego in that sense. But, I think she's more of a Rick Scott conservative in some ways, kind of a throwback to that bygone era a little bit. So
What does that mean to people who may not know?
it's sort of like a difference between the Ron DeSantis tone. Like Ron DeSantis would score a lot of victories to try to get on Fox News and things like that, and take a lot of confrontational stands. And I think Pasadena is more of a let's do this more incrementally kind of thing. Let's not do things that are too confrontational. Let's not do things that don't make sense. But in reality, the House and the governor got 80, 90% of what they wanted. So, I think she changed the tone superficially. But like any Senate president, it's kind of limited in what they really do, because the Senate kind of goes along to get along. They work together with a little bit more collaboratively, and it's a little less partisan over there, even though both the House and Senate are supermajority Republican.
You highlighted an interesting bill by St. Johns County Republican Senator Travis Hudson. He, of course, is with the Hudson Companies, a home builder, vast, quantities of acreage and projects that him and his family are working on. But he had proposed an effort to crack down on people claiming damages from asbestos. Explain what that would have provided for and why that's something worth paying attention to.
Yeah, it's asbestos and silica basically, and his bill would have had people put on their attestation forms whether they ever smoked cigarettes or whether they were married.
What are those forms?
Attestation forms, attesting to.
For an injury, like if you're making a claim against a company, you're
Right.
suing for damages.
Yeah,
And so you'd have to add to that what information?
whether you're married or not, and whether you ever smoked cigarettes or not. And basically what this would have done in effect is given these companies who are dealing with people like silicosis or whatever, mesothelioma. I can't say that word, mesothelioma.
Mesothelioma. Oh, what
Yeah, we can't be accident lawyers.
mesothelioma.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Anyway, so
We can't get it.
yeah, so anyway, it would have stricken those claims, would have made it harder to actually file those claims and get something out of them. You got a very limited amount of time between diagnosis to actually dying in those cases. So, it was kind of a bill that would have made it harder for people who gave their lives, to hard labor to get any recourse at the end. And
Who benefits from that?
builders, developers, the corporate world. It didn't get through the House, though. It was something that just didn't get onto the House floor. So at least for one more year, that's not happening. And Hudson's actually termed out. So this may not be back.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask about the environment, generally speaking. If you can talk about, what we're seeing in Tallahassee as it compares to perhaps what's happening in the U.S. Capitol, how it compares to the Jacksonville City Council. Are we seeing hyper-partisan divides on all of those levels?
Well, environmental issues, one specifically, the Everglades, is one that gets a lot of state buy-in. And it's something that Governor DeSantis, when he got into office, he said he was going to focus on, and he has put money into that, Lake Okeechobee, things like that. In terms of local priorities, I don't think we've seen so much environmental things. We haven't gotten state help and septic tank phase out, which has been, a priority for a long time for this area. So I think most of the environmental programming is South Florida. So it's kind of a tale of two states in that regard.
David emailed, and this is kind of the $1 million question I think everybody has. What's up with the insurance crisis, and what, if any, news did we get out of Tallahassee for helping with the homeowners insurance crisis, for one?
Not much. I mean, the leadership position is that they've got to let the reforms that they passed previously take effect. So they didn't do that much this session. The governor keeps claiming that there are new companies, in the market. They're basically taking out citizens policies and so on. So there wasn't a lot of change in terms of homeowners for this session. They're basically thinking that what they did is going to work. If you create competition, will lower prices and so on.
And to be fair, I mean, last legislative session, they gave billions of dollars to the insurance industry in one way or another.
Yeah.
And we're hoping that was going to at least alleviate the pace of the increase, if not actually lower anybody's premiums.
Right. They put $3 billion into the reinsurance market, basically, which is the insurer for the insurer. And so by doing that, they were intending to stabilize the whole thing. And it all depends on what kind of weather we get this year. I mean, they're forecasting a heavier than normal storm season. If that happens, then these insurance companies are going to be in trouble. But if we get through it somehow, like last year, with minimal damage and one storm that really hits an unpopulated area, then that'll give the market time to stabilize. But a lot depends on the weather with it.
I believe the official posture from our governor was knock on wood, right?
Yeah, it was knock on wood. He said that in a radio interview that I caught in with a Boston outlet. So, it's kind of a tone deafness there. But Governor DeSantis, when he's running for president, he definitely is running for president.
AG, I want to bring in Cold Case Project founder and executive director Ryan Bachman. Ryan, you've been pushing for something called the Decker-Bachman Act, and that bill was not successful. Tell us about that act. What would it have done?
Right. Well, thanks for having me, Ann. And so the Decker-Bachman Act, the foundation and the core of the bill was to support families of unsolved homicides. And this was federal legislation that passed 2 years ago and then passed to the state level in Georgia last year and was at Florida, Minnesota, Illinois, and California legislatures this session, trying to give families a little bit of power back to actually request a reinvestigation of their loved one's cold case, while also prioritizing cold cases within law enforcement agencies. And as you mentioned, unfortunately, it failed in a committee and never made it to the floor.
This is called the Decker-Bachman Act. Who's it named for?
So the Decker-Bachman Act is Marilyn Decker, who was murdered down in South Florida, I believe in the mid-'80s. Her body was found in a canal. And the two detectives working her case worked for the Davie Police Department, and they were the ones that brought this legislation forward. They saw it happening in Georgia, so they started reaching out to Florida lawmakers and seeing who was interested in sponsoring a similar bill. They found Senator Osgood down in Broward County in South Florida. And then the other part of the bill is Clifford Bachman, who is my dad, and he was murdered here in Jacksonville, Florida in 2009. His case remains unsolved, and we were helping kind of structure the language of the legislation. And so they decided to name it after the two of us who were, key points in the bill's creation.
So this is obviously a personal story for you, and you've worked on this issue for many, many years now with Project Cold Case.
Yeah.
What are the challenges that families like yours face with these investigations when they go cold?
Well, the interesting thing is that, for the general public, all we ever see is investigative milestones. We hear about when the crime happens. We assume there's an investigation. There is. Then the case may go cold, and then it might get reopened, and it might get solved. And those are the only points that the public ever hears about. But in the meantime, there could be a decade time frame in there or longer, and these families are suffering day in and day out, and they don't have any power. Everything has been stripped from them. They don't have the information that's all available to law enforcement. They can't control who's willing to come forward. What evidence is available. They can't control the technology advancements. And so there's really a struggle with nowhere to turn. That's why Project Cold Case exists, to give them a place to come and support each other and try to identify investigative advancements that we might be able to suggest and to raise awareness so their loved one's not forgotten. So I think that's in whole what this bill was formed to do, and with a hope of providing families a little bit more control and some some seat at the table, so to speak.
Ryan, I want to ask you what you think happened, but I want to ask AG first. This bill on first reading got unanimously approved by the committee that it was brought to, and then it just kind of dies on the vine. What happens in a case like that? What's not happening?
Yeah, I mean, it basically comes down to a committee chair deciding not to hear the committee. It's unlike local bills where you go through the committees and the committee chair doesn't have discretion. And the state level, if one committee chair decides, hey, we're not going to hear this bill, we don't have the room on the agenda, whatever it is, ran out of time, whatever the excuse is, that's how it works. So in the Senate committee, where you actually had as a committee bill after it passed that first committee, it seemed to have momentum, but the next committee didn't hear it. And in the House, it got no hearing. And that's the thing. You can file legislation, and there's no obligation to hear it. I mean, we talked about Angie Nixon, for example. That's somebody whose bills never get heard by a committee. And this is kind of what happens sometimes, especially with Democratic sponsors, because Republicans are working with Republicans in the legislature on 90% of things. There are a few message legislation things that people work across the aisle on, but with something like this, it helps to have Republican advocacy.
How about law enforcement advocacy? I mean, he's talking about the fact that it was initiated by a couple of police officers, but where's the police union? If they're not backing it, can a bill that directly affects law enforcement get through?
It's very tough. I mean, if you have letter of support from police unions, from sheriff's offices, from state attorneys like Melissa Nelson or somebody like that, that can help. And that's really what you need. But you have to have the evidence of the Republican stakeholders, or else the legislature will say, that they're running out of time and they can't do it. And this happens with all kinds of worthy legislation every year. They just don't have time. It's like a subcommittee might meet 3 or 4 times, and it'll stop meeting around week 4 or 5. So, there's not many tickets on that train out of that committee sometimes.
Ryan Bachman, what do you believe happened in this case?
I believe it was a combination of partisan politics where 2 Democrats filed the legislation and did not have support. I talked to one of the individuals that helped get this bill filed, and he said they reached out to 3 Republican senators in the beginning and nobody would return their call. When they got to Senator Osgood, she felt like it was a worthy piece of legislation, and she adopted it. Throughout the process, we reached out to the Florida Sheriff's Association, the Police Chiefs Association. It was shocking to me the amount of support we had from the detective level across the state. Detectives wanted this. They supported this. They want to work these cases. They're committed and passionate about these cases. But somewhere up the chain of command, it would die. The Florida Sheriff's Association only endorses and supports a handful of criminal justice legislation every year. They wouldn't have a conversation with me. I feel like saying I don't oppose it, but I'm not going to support it. Well, if you're a lawmaker and the Florida Sheriff's Association is not willing to back something, then you're opposing it.
Do you feel like there were maybe just too many questions about what it might cost?
Funding, there was a fiscal issue to it. I also believe that the entities that were tasked with work in this legislation, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement and Florida International University, my personal opinion is that they weren't very transparent about what the money was going for, and they asked for more than they should have, and that was also a knock on the bill. Was there was too much fiscal, too much funding attached to it, with not a lot of explanation as to why it was going to cost that much.
I think, too, it's sometimes hard to persuade law enforcement that it's important to get feedback from victims' families or to allow them to drive the ship at all.
I am so glad you brought that up. So I met with as many people as I could. I reached out to as many people, sheriffs, state attorneys, this Florida Sheriff's Association, and I would listen to them, because for me, this bill was supposed to unite law enforcement, lawmakers, and survivors of unsolved homicides. We should not have been opposing each other during this. And I heard all of the reasons why, from their perspective, they didn't like the bill, or there was an error with it, or something they didn't agree with. Not one of them asked me for a victim perspective. Not one of them was concerned about what this feels like to families that are suffering through this kind of trauma for decades, some of them. And that stood out to me.
Well, Ryan Bachman, I would assume that this may come back next year, of Project Cold Case. We'll be watching. Florida politics correspondent AG Gancarski, thanks both of you for being here. I appreciate it.
Hey, thank you, Ann. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.